Buenas tardes. Estoy agradecido a estar con ustedes hoy y honrado a haber sido invitado a contribuir a este importante acontecimiento. Lamento que no pueda hablar español bastante bien para dar mi conferencia en su lenguaje BEA. Entonces, creo que deba pasar a inglés ahora, and the remainder will be more intelligible, I hope, the mass notwithstanding. So before I dive into my lecture, let me offer my sincere thanks to our hosts, both from the University of Navarra and also from UNIR, for their generous welcome this week. I'm particularly grateful to Ruth, to Alex, and Jero from Navarra, and also to Estefania, who I think is not present today, but who was tremendously helpful in the run-up to the event, and grateful as well to Pepe and Santiago from UNIR and other representatives from the university who've been so generous in their hospitality and in their help. As Flynn mentioned, my role at the Human Flourishing Program is primarily focused on advancing our understanding of human flourishing and its diverse aspects, and also on promoting the integration of knowledge from across the humanities and the social sciences. So in my talk today, I'd like to reflect a bit on models for forming moral character, which are drawn primarily from religious communities, which is a core area of focus for our empirical research in our program. And I'll do so by bringing some classic figures from the Christian theological archive, Christian theology being my home discipline, into conversation with our empirical research program. And so hopefully giving you something of the flavor of the kind of research that we're conducting on a week-to-week basis. And I'll say, by way of a warning and also by way of an apology, that I'm afraid that my lecture, being the last one, is also perhaps going to be the most theoretically dense, I think, of the interventions today. So I know we've had an immensely rewarding intellectual banquet so far, and I hope that my offering won't be too indigestible for you. I'm also a very sort of traditional, I guess you'd say, lecturer, and so I'm not going to use slides, because when I made a PowerPoint, they were just long quotations, which you don't want to look at, I think. So we'll proceed without them. But let's dive in. Knowledge puffs up, St. Paul warned the church in Corinth, but love builds up. You see, some of Paul's eager converts had convinced themselves that their possession of esoteric knowledge, the secret and hidden wisdom of God, as Paul called it in the same letter, set them above the unwashed masses, both within and without the church. Paul completely rejected this way of thinking. If I understand all mysteries and all knowledge, he insisted in the same letter, but have not love, I am nothing. St. Paul saw clearly that knowing can go wrong not only by producing false beliefs, but also by producing true beliefs in the wrong way, or for the wrong reasons. Paul didn't at all intend to denigrate the desire for knowledge and wisdom in themselves. He goes on in 1 Corinthians to remind his followers that among the mature, we do impart wisdom. And in his epistle to the Colossians, he went so far as to insist that in Christ, all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are hidden. He feared instead that the Corinthians had been seduced by knowledge devoid of love. Knowledge of this sort puffs up, leavened, as it so often is, with malice. Ancient and medieval Christians had a name for the disordered appetite for knowledge. They called it curiositas in Latin, curiosity. Curiosity or curiositas is a vice word in Latin. And it is at work when two mathematicians independently prove a difficult theorem, but then sink into an acrimonious feud in dividing the spoils. It equally rears its head when a scientist successfully experiments on human twins to give them genetic resistance to HIV. We could go on and on. Unfortunately, everyday English no longer has a word for this perverse desire for knowledge. Lust and gluttony, the sexual and the culinary appetites perversions, are still with us, if only just. But we no longer feel the medieval's instinctive aversion from curiosity, notwithstanding that English speakers still unthinkingly repeat the proverb about it's killing the cat. This is why it kills the cat, it's a bad thing. Now, I don't think it's particularly controversial to observe that curiosity, knowledge divorced from love, is one of the besetting vices of our age, or that one of its great contemporary houses of worship is Harvard University, where I work. Harvard, of course, hums with inquiry and discovery in every imaginable field. The university has produced more Nobel Prize winners than any other institution. Nonetheless, it is also a place of deep discontent, as Flynn mentioned, particularly among its students, who seem constantly and fruitlessly to be asking themselves what all of their talent and exertions are for. And indeed, the malaise seems to be general, despite the astonishing amelioration of ordinary life achieved by the scientific and industrial revolutions. My personal favorites include penicillin, sewage treatment plants, and Novocaine. There's a wide body of evidence suggesting that people in the rich developed world, especially but not only in the United States, enjoy lower life satisfaction, less meaning and purpose, and fewer deep relationships than their poorer neighbors. All of these trends have been worsening for some time, and I would hazard a guess that the disruptions of the past 2 years have not helped matters any. Knowledge puffs up, St. Paul said, but love builds up. We today are at least 2 centuries into a radical, if often haphazard, experiment in defying that proposition, conducted via a relentless campaign to instill knowledge in young men and women without much regard to helping them develop those ordered loves which St. Augustine identified with the virtues. This experiment took hold in England earlier than almost anywhere else. Apologies to Ruth and Ed, but and it took hold in England notably under the influence of Jeremy Bentham's philosophy of utilitarianism, whose practical politics consisted above all in campaigns for broader education in technical and scientific subjects, and for entrusting political authority to experts in these fields. Needless to say, there was an awful lot of good and right reform mixed into these programs. But as a whole, utilitarianism aspired to the rule not so much of the wise or even the learned, but particularly of the curious, we might say, in the classical sense. Now, the utilitarians were a dour and supremely self-important lot, and so they naturally drew the fire of England's most brilliant satirists, notably Charles Dickens in his novel Hard Times, but also criticism from the deeply insightful and indeed prescient English writer St. John Henry Newman, who I'd like to talk about a little bit in the middle part of this discussion. And Newman wrote with great energy about the problems of educational reform in England, both in the first part of his career as an Anglican priest and an Oxford Don and a leader of the Oxford movement within the Church of England, and then later as a Catholic convert and an Oratorian priest and controversialist. One of his first interventions on this topic was in a series of sermons on faith and reason, which he delivered in Oxford's University Church of St. Mary the Virgin. In one of these sermons, he complained that while the 18th century had prided itself on being an age of evidences, it was in fact merely a time when love was cold. One of Newman's first sustained attacks on the idea of social transformation through the accumulation and dispersion of facts came in his essay, The Tamworth Reading Room. This piece was a hilariously satirical response to a lecture given by the great reforming politician Sir Robert Peel at the opening of a public library in 1841. What prompted Newman's scathing reply was Peel's conviction that, as he put it, useful knowledge is the great instrument of education. It is the parent of virtue, the nurse of religion. It exalts man to his highest perfection and is the sufficient scope of his most earnest exertions. Newman had less than no time for this idea. His response is a snort of derision. I imagine his eyes rolling out of his head as he penned it. That the art of life consists in the cultivation of knowledge, Newman maintained, is the veriest of pretenses which sophist or mountebank ever profess to a gaping auditory. And I just am pausing now and thinking about what the poor simultaneous translators are going through and attempting to render that, and I do apologize. He goes on, if virtue be a mastery over the mind, if its end be action, if its perfection be inward order, harmony, and peace, we must seek it in graver and holier places than libraries and reading rooms. We'll come back in just a moment to what those graver and holier places might be. Newman's skepticism about the utilitarian plan for ending England's many social woes was rooted in his fundamentally Augustinian sense, is his sort of devotion to the thought of St. Augustine of Hippo, his fundamentally Augustinian sense that human beings are, at bottom, bundles of love, as the great Augustine scholar Eric Gregory put it. For instance, in his homilies on the first epistle of John, St. Augustine famously distilled the moral life into a single maxim: love and do what you like. Dilige and quod vis fac in Latin. He didn't mean by this that anything you happen to love is fine, in the sort of Beatles sense that love is all you need. What he meant instead is that well-formed love doesn't need to make constant reference to a detailed rule book, because love is the fulfilling of a law, as St. Paul and indeed Jesus said. Now, Newman's perspective is that a form of education which acts primarily on the head but does not shape the heart in Pascal's sense, the heart which has its reasons, right, which the reason knows not, that this kind of education will be largely ineffective in changing anyone's mind, much less his life, perhaps excepting a few neurotic hyper-intellectuals like me and like Newman, frankly. Logic makes but a sorry rhetoric with the multitude, Newman reminded Peel. First, shoot round corners, and you may not despair of converting by a syllogism. Newman understood, in short, that bare knowledge puffs up. Only love can build up. Newman returned again and again over the course of his long career to the limits of mere knowledge, we might say, in effecting genuine moral transformation. One of his first projects after being ordained an Oratorian priest was to serve as rector of the newly founded Catholic University in Ireland. This new institution opened up the ranks of higher education to Ireland's Catholics for the first time. But Newman remained clear-sighted about the limits of scholarship in changing its students' character. So during his tenure as rector, Newman delivered a series of 9 lectures on the nature of university education, later published as The Idea of the University. And the 5th of these lectures, which is titled Knowledge, Its Own End, is particularly interesting for our purposes, since it addresses the question of whether a university's, quote, teaching, viewed relatively to the taught, carries the attribute of utility along with it. In short, whether university education is a useful thing for its students. And Newman's answer to this question is a characteristically overheated no. Liberal education viewed in itself, he writes, is simply the cultivation of the intellect as such, and its object is nothing more or less than intellectual excellence, which is, he insists, an object as intelligible as the cultivation of virtue, while at the same time, it is absolutely distinct from it. He's prone to very extreme formulations. We can maybe walk him back a bit. Newman's point is that humanistic scholarship stands in a different track from the cultivation of virtue in general, to the extent that it enlarges the intellect without training the sentiments. And here again, I think his writing is driven by the same Augustinian view of man that I identified at work, in his earlier writings as well. Newman thinks that we most fundamentally respond to the world through our loves, rather than through any explicit process of reasoning. Newman sums up the problem in this 5th discourse in one of his most memorable images. Quarry the granite rock with razors, he writes, or moor the vessel with a thread of silk. Then you may hope, with such keen and delicate instruments as human knowledge and human reason, to contend against those giants, the passion and the pride of man. Quarry the granite rock with razors. Try to cut a giant block of granite out of a stone quarry with a razor blade, and then you might have a shot, he thinks, of sitting people down with books and changing their lives in general. And of course, the lesson of this image is that that's not going to happen. That's Newman's view. He's quite extreme, as I said. Now, Newman's point is not that the liberal arts are useless in general, actually, that they're useless, they have no applications to ordinary life. He goes on in the 7th of his 9 discourses to describe the bearing of a liberal education on the course of professional life and insists that, particularly when it's pursued as an end in itself, liberal education actually is a profoundly useful thing. It's quite striking to consider, actually, that Newman doesn't mention this, that during this period, the Victorian era, Britain was, of course, taking over half the world or so with a civil service staffed largely by classics graduates, from Oxford and Cambridge, which is quite quite striking, actually. Newman's point, really, in this fifth discourse is just that scholarship in general is ill-suited to transform a person's character. Now, illustrations of the intellectually cultivated moral monster are not hard to come by, and Flynn gave us a nice one in the figure of Nero. But one that stayed with me over the years comes in an episode from the life of the English travel writer Patrick Leigh Fermor. If you haven't ever read his books, I quite recommend them to you. He's one of the great prose stylists of last century in English. Now, when the Second World War broke out, Fermor had been living in Greece for some years, and so when he joined the British military, he was eventually assigned to a clandestine unit of military intelligence on the island of Crete, which was occupied by the Nazis. You know, he spoke modern Greek, so this came in handy. Now, Fermor and his comrades eventually carried out an absurd and daring plot to kidnap General Krypa, the Nazi commandant on the island. They stopped his car on the road one night. They drove him with a pistol in his ribs through about a dozen Nazi checkpoints and eventually spirited him away into the mountains, where they hiked to the sea and dumped him onto a British submarine. There's a terrific movie made about this, actually, called Ill Met by Moonlight in the 50s, I think, which I recommend. Now, Fermor later recounted, much later, in one of his most famous books called A Time of Gifts, he recounted how, as they were marching single file through that rugged Cretan terrain, the sun suddenly dawned over Mount Ida in the distance. And Krypa stopped dead and began reciting an apposite Horatian ode from memory. He'd studied Horace, you know, in the gymnasium, you know, as a young man. Vides ut alta state nive candidum soracte. You see how Mount Soracte stands bright with snow. Fermor, who had also memorized Horace as a boy, picked up where his enemy left off and recited the ode to the end. Now, you know, there's not one lesson, I think, to be gleaned from this episode. And on the one hand, you know, it represents a kind of beautiful moment of reconciliation achieved, you know, by a common investment in the classics of the Western tradition, you know, between these two mortal enemies in the midst of so much pain and suffering. But on the other hand, Krypa had obviously had a first-rate liberal education. Indeed, by today's standards, he was extraordinarily cultivated, right? I mean, I'm, you know, even decent, supposedly decent Latinists, you know, like me, don't have a lot of Horace by heart, you know, anymore. Krypa's liberal education, of course, did not keep him from becoming a Nazi general. It did not keep towering geniuses such as Martin Heidegger or Werner Heisenberg in Germany from becoming devoted members of the Reich. Newman's point is that it's just a category mistake to think that the studies of the kind that had allowed Krypa to recite Horace from memory, or that had made Heidegger, you know, an expert exegete of Aristotle, that those kinds of studies would, in general, give you the moral fiber needed for heroic dissent against the Nazis, the sort of thing that we, you know, associate with Dietrich Bonhoeffer or someone like that today. You're digging in the wrong place, you know, if that's what you're hoping to get from Horace. So Newman wasn't convinced that education modeled on the utilitarian reign of curiosity could achieve much in the way of moral transformation. But that doesn't mean that he thought universities had no moral responsibility to their students. Quite the contrary. He just thought they had to exercise that responsibility primarily in ways other than the kind of instruction that makes you knowledgeable about Horace or Aristotle or other classics of the Western canon. For Newman, the heart of university was really the tutorial system, which is what makes the British system so distinctive, you know, within the world's universities. It's a model which has never had much currency, I think, in other places, but it does still survive today in a sort of attenuated form in Oxford and Cambridge. And during Newman's time at Oxford, fellows were assigned to one-on-one relationships with students, and they served as their tutors, which in Latin means guardians. There's a whole story to be told. In a way, the whole story is sort of in the transformation of this word from the notion implying a sort of whole person moral responsibility to teacher, essentially. You know, there's been a sort of contraction of the notion. As Newman's niece, Anne Moseley, recounted in her memoirs, Newman liked to observe that in the Laudian statutes for Oxford, so going way back, you know, to the reign of Elizabeth, I suppose, although Flynn can correct me if I'm wrong about that. In the Laudian statutes, a tutor was not a mere academical policeman or constable, but a moral and religious guardian of the youth committed to him. This was the logic behind Oxford's ancient requirement that fellows be unmarried members of the clergy who lived in college with their students. Their professional responsibilities did not stop at the lecture hall, but extended through meals and common worship with their students. Indeed, as late as 1878, Queen's College at Oxford advertised an open fellowship in the following terms: an election will be held to one fellowship on Tuesday, January 28, 1879. No person will be eligible unless he is either a priest or a deacon of the Church of England or declares that he intends to take orders. They must be persons of unblemished character who shall have passed all the examinations and must be unmarried. So this is quite a different set of qualifications than you would find. It's hard to imagine seeing any of those qualifications, really, except for the examinations listed in any academic job ad today. So already during Newman's tenure, the tutorial system was beginning to give way to a more content-driven model of education. And Newman fought these modernizing reforms tooth and nail until he resigned his fellowship at Oxford in 1843, insisting that the university was turning tutors into mere administrators, essentially. And Newman's view, as I've already hinted in several places, was that a university could most effectively shape students' characters insofar as it partnered with or adopted the forms of a religious community, both in the sense that the tutor should exercise a pastoral role in the lives of his students, and still more directly in the sense that he thought universities should invest deeply in promoting religious life on campus and in direct and indirect ways, particularly through common worship. So that there's an intuition at work, which is only sort of half developed in Newman's thought about the connection between an ideal academic community and religious participation. And this is, I'd like to make a slight shift now in our focus and sort of unpack that intuition, put some flesh on it by reference to recent work that's been done in the social sciences on the relationship between religious participation and human flourishing in a broad sense, but particularly moral formation, formation of virtue and moral character. Now, Flynn mentioned our director, Tyler Vanderweel's proposed definition of flourishing as a state in which all aspects of a person's life are well. I think it's useful for our purposes today to sort of subdivide that conception of flourishing into three domains, okay? And I'll just talk briefly about how religion seems to affect each of them. So, and this is a typology I'm borrowing from the theologian Miroslav Volf, if you're interested. So there's a life that's led well, and this is, we might think of as a virtuous life, a life of moral character. There's also a life that's going well, in the sense of a life which is adequately supplied with the necessities, food, clothing, shelter, but also a life, in which in which people have their relishes, as Plato says, in the opening books of the Republic, in which people have things to enjoy. And then finally, there's a life that feels good, you might say, a life of subjective happiness, of joy. You put those three components together, you have something close to a full-orbed conception of human flourishing. There's been a tremendous burst of research in the social sciences in the last 20 or 30 years in trying to understand the way in which religious participation affects each of these domains. And as the study designs have gotten better, the picture has come into sharper focus and the effects have become even clearer. So let me just mention a few of the findings, some of them coming from research conducted within our own program in the last few years. So there's a great deal of evidence which suggests that religious belief and practice, in fact, generally does make participants fairer, more honest, and generous in their dealings with others. So in one study, the incidence of reported domestic violence, and I should say almost all of the data I'm going to be describing is from American settings, and so it overwhelmingly concerns Christians. There's some from European settings, also heavily focused on Christians. We're launching just now a big study called the Global Flourishing Study, which we hope will expand the reach of this research to non-Christian populations all around the world. And so check back in 5 years, we'll know more about what's going on in other places. But so one study found that the incidence of reported domestic violence was about 60.7% higher among men who never attended church compared to men who attended at least weekly. Arthur Brooks, who Flynn mentioned before, is one of our faculty affiliates at Harvard. He's found that charitable giving, including to secular as well as religious charities, is about 3.5 times higher among regular service attenders than it is among never attenders. And those are findings that are consistent with more recent findings from the sociologist Robert Putnam. There's very interesting experimental work along these lines too, using controlled experiments, which are really good at isolating causation. And in experimental settings, religious believers, particularly believers in vigilant and moralizing gods, not all gods are like this, believe it or not, but religious believers consistently show higher levels of trustworthiness, generosity, and cooperation in experimental settings and in economics games and that sort of thing than non-believers, particularly but not only when they cooperate with co-religionists. And these findings are complemented by observational data that, as the Harvard anthropologist Joseph Henrich notes, across countries, the belief in a contingent afterlife, meaning essentially belief in a final judgment or reincarnation, according to karma, something like that, belief in a contingent afterlife is associated with greater economic productivity and less crime. The higher the percentage of people who believe in a contingent afterlife, the lower the murder rate in a given country. By contrast, the percentage of people who believe only in heaven is associated with a higher murder rate, believe it or not. And I'll skim a little bit over the second two categories because they're somewhat less germane, I think, to our sort of core purpose today. A life that's going well and a life that feels good. But again, the evidence there is quite striking. I'll just mention one figure, I suppose, which to me is quite astounding. That we found in one of our program's papers that over a 16-year period, a huge cohort of 70,000 nurses, we examined, comparing religious participants to people who never attended religious services. Weekly service attendees in this cohort over that 16-year period were 33% less likely to die of any cause, even after controlling for everything you can imagine in terms of health and socioeconomic status and what have you. 33% less likely to die than people who never went to church. And there's similar, very interesting data about life satisfaction, overall sense of purpose, among religious believers compared with never attenders. And we could go on and on, I think. And I mentioned all of these findings, and I've sort of piled up, I know, a good bit of data in the last few minutes, partly by way to sort of underscore how striking they are. The evidence is not, we're not talking about a couple of weekly design studies. There's a really large body of evidence which suggests that religious participation does something very, very striking to the characters of people who participate in them regularly. And there's really nothing that compares to them. We consistently find in our studies, which often examine other kinds of social connection and belonging, voluntary societies, participation in educational institutions, among others, that religious participation, the effects of religious participation are consistently larger than all other kinds of social connection combined. They're even stronger individually than marriage and family life in terms of their effects on mortality especially, but other aspects of character too, I think. It's really interesting to ask, and this is in a way the reason I bring up this data. It naturally prompts the question, well, how do they do that? Other institutions would like to do that too, right? Including universities. This is why we're here today. Like to find ways to shape the character of their participants in really profound ways. And the answer to that question, as you might imagine, is that it's complicated. The mechanisms they're varied, they're many, and they interact, And so there isn't one answer, of course. And this is what makes religious community so powerful, is that there are so many mechanisms that are operating simultaneously, usually subconsciously. People don't know that they're being worked on in the way that they are. I'll just say, just to give a a couple of examples of how this seems to go. And again, there are ways of teasing apart these effects statistically if you have a large enough data set, which let us say with some confidence what's causing what, in a given case. So, just for example, religious observance seems to decrease depression and increase life satisfaction, particularly by expanding participants' networks of social support. Right? So this is intuitive. But also by promoting a sense of hope and a sense of meaning in life. Religious participation gives you sort of deep sense of purpose, or it can. Other important causes of religious participation's effect on mortality in particular seem to depend on the way that religious observance decreases depression, but also smoking, and sort of increases, as I mentioned, people's sense of hope and purpose. Let's skip down a little bit because I'm mindful of the time. I noted above, I think I might have skipped over it, but there's another quite interesting finding is that regular attenders are about 50% less likely to divorce in the United States, at least, than never attenders. And again, it's interesting to ask why. Social support's part of it. Part of it is explicit moral teaching. That you should stay together if you can. Part of it also seems to be that religious participants are just generally less depressed than people who aren't. And so they're easier maybe to live with. The causal pathways in each of these cases they're numerous and they're overlapping and they're probably mutually reinforcing, right? So they're not the sort of thing that you can easily detach, lift out one element, of the religious life and transplant it to another place and expect it to be sort of grafted on seamlessly, So, in concluding this lecture, and I'm approaching the end, I'd like to just venture a couple of suggestions about the lessons that universities interested in character education might draw, both from this Pauline insistence I started with that mere knowledge puffs up, but love builds up, and the way that's worked out in John Henry Newman's thought about the character of the vocation, to be a university tutor as he understood it. And then along with this sort of social scientific picture about the way in which this sort of profound ways that religious participation seems to shape the characters of participants. So I've already mentioned two broad approaches, and I'll just talk about them both briefly. So on the one hand, universities can partner directly with religious communities. And on the other hand, they can also seek to imitate the forms of life to the extent they can of religious communities. And these are not mutually exclusive approaches, of course, you can do both. The first of them, it's worth saying, is by far the most traditional one. Virtually every university in the West founded over a century ago, say, and of course many of them founded more recently, had a explicitly religious foundation. And this is not accidental. Christians have been saying for a long time that the God they worship is truth, And so from that perspective, every act of knowing is an implicit act of worship. There are analogous conceptions, of course, of the religious life and other traditions, which also lend themselves to the establishment of houses of learning. Fascinating analogies, really, between the growth of monastic houses of study in Tibet, say, roughly at the same time, really, as the rise of the great universities in Western Europe. And universities tend to have in their past, this sort of explicitly religious vocation, and it often still marks universities in very profound ways. Most universities, or many of them, have chapels right at the center of campus. The largest building is a church, effectively. Flynn and I both spent part of our education at Duke University, which is just dominated by an absolutely enormous and beautiful Gothic chapel. Duke is notionally Methodist, but very, very notionally at this point. And the chapel is a kind of odd, almost absurd fixture on campus. No one quite knows what to do with it. There are analogies at other universities. And of course, many universities today have retained that religious foundation, and the University of Navarra is one of them. And I've been very encouraged to hear over the last few days from new friends from Navarra and also from UNIR about the way in which religious life is integrated and encouraged, within the life of the university. Many of the people I've met from Navarra in the last few days attend Mass daily, which is a really extraordinary thing to be able to do. And I would just suggest that if universities want to produce more virtuous students, perhaps also healthier and happier students, one very straightforward, the empirical evidence is quite clear. One very straightforward way to do that is to encourage religious participation among their students. There's just I think in terms of the body of empirical evidence, nothing else comes close really in terms of what we know works. Which is not to say nothing else works by any means, but this is something which we ought to consider, I think. And of course, there are a variety of ways of doing this. Not every school has a strong confessional identity. Even those that do often don't require students to attend chapel. But there are ways, more and less subtle ways, of encouraging religious participation or welcoming it even, onto campus. And we should one of the core ideas really at the heart of our program's research on religious participation is that quite apart really from its sort of the adequacy of its claims, any religion's claims about the truth of things, there just is a tremendous amount of empirical evidence that they shape people, even in the here and now, in very important ways that we neglect at our peril, frankly, I think. And this is just it's a very interesting sort of social experiment that we're running on ourselves collectively. What is a society like that attempts to disavow any orientation, collective orientation to the transcendent, And so, of course, this is something to consider, but that's often not possible, as I've mentioned. Many universities are avowedly secular places, pluralistic places, required by the state to maintain a sort of strict neutrality, towards religion. But even in that case, I think there are interesting analogies which it behooves universities and university professors to think about as they consider what their own vocation in shaping the lives of students are. Because one of the most striking things to me about our research on the way in which religious communities affect their participants is that doctrinal teaching, sermons and Bible studies, they're by no means the most important means of shaping the lives of participants in religious communities. Not that they're not important. Of course, it's a crucial element of any of the great religions. To have a creed, to engage in some kind of catechesis, and to reinforce your beliefs through teaching. But equally important, maybe more important, are the ways in which religions work their way into every corner of a believer's life. They shape daily life. They shape daily rhythms. They shape your circle of friends. They fill your life with reminders, with nudges in the behavioral economic sense. Crosses, church steeples, blessings at meals, which are sort of constant prompts to remember this is what we teach, this is what we believe, this is what we do. And they reinforce all of those teachings by embedding people within a day-to-day community, a community where they're in fellowship not just with peers but also with mentors, who are we've discussed this some, I suppose, in other talks, but having meals with them, having real conversations with them, and I guess I would just suggest that universities will succeed in forming real virtues in their students to the extent that they too take up something like these immersive methods that religious communities put to such effective use. Again, whether by directly partnering with religious communities or by adapting these strategies for their own uses. So that means at the very least moving away from thinking about the vocation of a professor as primarily a lecturer and thinking about that vocation as also in a way as a kind of mentorship. Ideally one that's conducted, face-to-face over meals, if possible. But of course, this is not always possible. It'd be great if they also had some kind of communal ritual which united them in a higher purpose than winning a Saturday football game, which is sort of the American equivalent of a church service on most university campuses. And it's a deeply religious and frankly liturgical experience in many cases if you've ever attended one. Now, universities were once terrific at this. They've largely lost those crucial skills today, despite the warnings of people like Newman. But what was once known can be relearned, and I think one of the challenges facing the task of character education in the university today is precisely to relearn those lessons, which they once knew. And if universities want to learn them anew, they'd be hard pressed to find a better teacher than religious communities, I think. So this is my maybe not so modest proposal for character education at the university. And I'll be happy to talk about it further with Flynn and the rest of you. So thank you so much.